Dr. Kelly Enright is Associate Professor and Curator of Campus Collections at Flagler College, our generous hosts. Her work focuses on portrayals of nature and American culture, human-animal relationships, museums, historic preservation, explorers, and travel. She is the author of numerous books, including The Maximum of Wilderness, The Jungle in the American Imagination, which came out in 2012, I believe. Her published essays include Franklinia in the Garden, Memorializing the Foliage, Preserving Heritage in Extinction and Memorial Culture from 2023. So join me in welcoming Dr. Kelly Enright.
My talk is very different, and I appreciate the contrast in the ways that we are looking at different species of plants. As a historian, I'm really interested in Franklinia for its cultural meanings, almost looking at it more like an artifact, and in one of the publications I wrote about it, a souvenir of a time and place. And so we're going to explore a little bit of the history of Franklinia, more than its botany and ecology, but there's some fascinating, inconclusive theories about the Franklinia and whether it grows, whether we can grow it in its native habitat today, or former native habitat. So my talk will look at what I have kind of identified as three different stages of the history of Franklinia. These are the finding of it by the Bartrams, by John and William in the 1700s, losing it because it became extinct in the wild. In fact, it was the first plant that Anglo-Americans observed down to its last one in America, as far as I can tell. So a little footnote on that. As far as I have read, and I've read a lot about extinction, it really is quite significant. And then people that went back to look for it. Dreams of rediscovery, I call this. And this was a trend in the early 20th century. People looking for all kinds of lost, in quotes, animals and plants all over the world. And then the third stage is the remembering, the memorialization of the plant. And this has direct connection, of course, to the legacy of the Bartrams themselves. So let's begin. Okay, so the landscape from which Franklinia originates is the Altamaha River in Georgia outside the town of Darien, where John and William Bartram recorded the tree in October 1763, near Fort Barrington. John had been appointed the royal botanist to the King of England earlier that year. Sorry, I'm a little disorganized here. Earlier that year, after spending some 30 years collecting, classifying, and propagating American plants. When William traveled through the eastern woodlands and swamps of the region again in 1773 to 1776, he collected many plants for study and propagation at their gardens in Philadelphia, well, near Philadelphia, and for collaboration and naming through the European British botanical experts. So Franklinia was in bloom when William visited it in the 1770s in the wild along the Altamaha River. And this is what he had to say about it. I passed through a well-inhabited district, mostly rice plantations on the waters of Cathead Creek, a branch of the Altamaha. There's many spellings of this river's name, on drawing near the fort. I was greatly delighted at the appearance of two beautiful shrubs in all their blooming graces. One of them appeared to be a species of Gordonia, but the flowers are larger and more fragrant than those of Gordonia lasianthus, which is the native loblolly bay, which we still have quite a lot of in the southeast. So no description of Franklinia appeared in Bartram's journal, which he sent to his sponsor, Fothergill. He only wrote about it in his travels. So this is many years after he actually took the travels. And this really frustrates historians. We're not really sure exactly where he saw it. We don't really know exactly when he saw it, except for what he claims in travels. So one thing that he did do that was more useful was to send seeds to his father at the gardens, and there they propagated it. The first one flowered in 1781, and it grew there. I'll get back to their propagation towards the end of the talk, but it grew there without a name. So on August 16th, 1783, William wrote to Carl Linnaeus the Younger, who had inherited his father's position at the Uppsala University as sort of the botanical guys in charge of naming things in the 1700s. And this really was a political and power struggle in some situations that other historians have covered as well. Like, how exactly do you get your name approved, and who do you get to name things after is sort of a fascinating part of botanical history. But Linnaeus failed to answer William before he passed away in November of that year. Nevertheless, Bartram continued, and he used the name Franklinia altamaha in a broadside catalog of plants that they were selling out of the garden, even though the European authorities had not said, yes, this is a new species and we're going to give you your name. He sent the same request to Robert Barclay, who was in England, stressing the rarity of this plant and sort of pleading, saying, yes, this is not Gordonia, this is something entirely new. He said, I have traveled by land from Pennsylvania to the banks of the Mississippi, over almost all the territory in that distance between the seashore and the first mountains, crossed all the rivers and ascended them from their capes a many miles, and searched their various branches, yet never saw this beautiful tree growing wild, in one spot on the Altamaha, about 30 miles from the seacoast. Despite this, Bartram received a reply that the botanist in England, this is Barclay's quote, will not allow it to be properly named. Sir Joseph Banks was the new president of the Royal Society, and he decided to place it in the genus Gordonia. Though the European authorities denied Bartram his new species, his cousin, Humphrey Marshall, designated the tree Franklinia altamaha in a 1785 publication published in America called Arbustrum Americanum. It was the first comprehensive tree guide published in the new United States. It was dedicated to Benjamin Franklin. Let's see where I'm going with this. Marshall's book marks an important date in the history of botanical exchange. It was kind of an assertion that Americans can do this too. It was a massive scientific tome, and it listed all the Linnaean names, detailed descriptions, uses, as well as a catalog of things for sale from Marshall's nursery, of course. And it said he would sell at a reasonable rate boxes of seeds so that you can grow these plants in your own garden. Now, one of the things that you're probably already thinking is like, yes, this name Franklinia is obviously after Ben Franklin, and the common name of the plant is Ben Franklin tree. So you might be thinking, well, yeah, why wouldn't the British want to give the Americans this name? Well, Ben Franklin was obviously a revolutionary, and this is 1780s, and America had only just become America. So there's a bit of politics going on here as well. I have not seen in the sources from that time the European botanists saying, oh, we can't give this a new genus or a new genus name because of this specific thing on the plant. It all seems to have to do with this politics of naming, which the former curator at the Bartram's Garden, Joel Fry, who also did a lot of work on Franklinia, said it was a move to enforce European supremacy in botanical nomenclature. So I'm not alone in this suspicion that there was something going on here. So the Bartrams wanted to honor their friend Ben Franklin, and then the second part of the name is to refer to the river on which it was found. And the idea that this was so soon after the Revolution is important too, because Ben Franklin was actually the representative for the colony of Georgia in England. And so he also had this connection, not just to American Revolution, but also to Georgia specifically. There's another piece of this puzzle too. Many people have not heard of the Altamaha River. Maybe many of you have because you live in the Southeast, but it's not a very famous river in your usual American history books. But it actually had a specific symbolism as a very wild and unwelcoming place in the 1700s, the late 1700s. The Irish poet Oliver Goldsmith vilified it as a savage, hostile wilderness in a poem he wrote called The Deserted Village. The poem was a commentary upon the impact to Britain of migrants to America. In other words, Britain was losing many of its agricultural families. And this poem was kind of an assertion that people should stay home. You shouldn't go to America. You need to stay here. We're not going to have an agricultural economy. And so in order to discourage people from coming to America, this is what he wrote about the region. Through torrid tracks and fainting steps they go, where wild Altamaha murmurs to their woe, far different there from all that charmed before the various terrors of that horrid shore, those blazing suns that dart a downward ray and fiercely shed intolerable day. That last line I definitely understand this past week. Those matted woods where birds forget to sing, but silent bats in drowsy clusters cling. Those poisonous fields with rank luxuriance crowned, where the dark scorpion gathers death around. Get the idea, this is not a place you want to live, right? So this kind of idea that this is a wild, savage place that's being painted from the British perspective, claiming that Altamaha name for the plant, I think, is also asserting a certain kind of, yes, this is wild and you guys should stay out. We're going to live here instead of you. And so in its extinction, Franklinia actually becomes more wild than when it was alive. And this is sort of the main thesis of what I'm working with in my look at Franklinia. When it was alive, it was very rare. People didn't really know about it. When Bartram collected it, part of John and William's work was to send things over to England, plant collectors throughout America, but in the Southeast we're talking about here, who were doing the same thing, who don't really have the same name. Two of those were Moses Marshall and Luigi Castiglione. They both wrote about the species in 1790, seeing it in pretty much the same spot as the Bartrams. And the last recorded sighting in the wild seems to have been in 1803 by John Lyon, who was a Scottish plant collector. He located only 6 or 8 trees and remarked how strange it was that the plant should not be found in other locales in the United States. Lyon suggested that it was likely depleted by horticultural collectors seeking to make a profit. A theory with some weight, but if there were so few to begin with, over-collecting probably does not fully explain its extinction or why it was so rare when the Bartrams were there in the first place. It became a well-known plant in nursery catalogs, so I do find it in a lot of catalogs. So people were propagating it other than the Bartrams in the 1800s as well, including in Europe. And then throughout the Northeast as well as in South Carolina, I found catalogs where people were selling Franklinia. And it became a species that people wanted in their gardens. In fact, one person calls it, if you had a Franklinia in your garden in the Victorian era, it was like an aristocratic specimen, like you were fancy, in other words, if you were able to have a Franklinia. And at this time, extinction was something that wasn't really fully understood. In the early 1800s, there were lots of theories about it. Some people didn't think it could really happen, that it might still be out there. We just haven't seen it. Charles Lyell actually visited the same region of Darien, Georgia at the end of 1848 and the beginning of 1846. And there he spent time with Hamilton Cooper, who was famous for having the largest natural history library in the South at the time. And he was working through ideas about evolution, thinking about Darwin, thinking about do I agree with these ideas. And he said that if 2 species of the same genus and of closely allied habits people the same district and we cannot say why one of them is rare and the other common, what right have we to consider if the rarer of the 2 should cease to exist altogether? And what he's thinking through here is the Gordonia, the loblolly bay. Why does that still grow if the Franklinia doesn't? In illustration of this principle, he writes in his book, A Second Visit to the United States of North America. In illustration of this principle, I may refer to two beautiful evergreens flourishing in this part of Georgia, species of Gordonia, or Franklinia, a plant allied to the camellia. One of these I saw everywhere in the swamps near the Altamaha, where it is called Loblolly Bay. This plant had a wide range. I am informed by Mr. Cooper to a very limited area, 20 miles in its greatest length, is the Franklinia, the same region where Bartram first discovered it 70 years ago. In no other spot in the whole continent of America has it ever been detected. If we were told that one of these two evergreens was destined in the next 2,000 or 3,000 years to become extinct, how could we conjecture which of them would endure the longest? So he's trying to understand the reasons for extinction here through this plant that has now, by this time, gone extinct in the wild. That's the term we use today. That term didn't really come into being until later in the 20th century. The next part of the story here is what the article is referring to that you're looking at on the screen, and this is the rediscovery searches. As sort of America began to think its borders were closed in the 1800s. There's a whole literature on the American West, for instance, talking about we've settled everything and now we need to really understand what's within our borders. Government surveys were sent out west to figure out every plant and animal species that was out there. Very little was done in the South. There were a couple, but not to the same extent that the U.S. government and geological expeditions were sent to explore the West. So a man named Henry William Ravenel was commissioned by Charles Singer Sargent, who was a big botanist in the Northeast, to go look for Franklinia. Sargent had published these compendiums of plants, and he would constantly say Franklinias may be extinct, and he wanted to know for sure. And Ravenel searched for a couple of years and even hired some other local people to search, and he couldn't find it anywhere. And this was 1881 that he kind of sounded the death knell on Franklinia in the wild and said it's really not there. We can't find it. However, instead of that being the end of the story, it was kind of the beginning. In the early 1900s, there was this massive idea that people had discovered everything. Right? It seems a little bit odd to us now, but in the 1910s, people had been to the North and South Pole, and this was sort of symbolic of humans have gone everywhere on Earth. This is the end of exploration. And so there's a botanical writer, her name is Alice Lounsbury, who didn't search for Franklinia herself, but wrote a very poetic essay about the searches for it. And she wrote, "Somewhere perchance it awaits its finder, ready to give honor and place to him that will make known its hiding place. Indeed, thinking to win the glory of its rediscovery, it is yearly sought for by enthusiastic, devoted souls, caring not that their search takes them through swamps, the undergrowth of which is thick and perilous, into places where the gray moss hangs in shroud-like masses, defying their efforts, where the air is humid and fever-laden, and into marshes where snakes have a boldness all their own. To such inconveniences, the one pricked with the idea of rediscovering Franklinia is indifferent. He feels only the thrill of joy that shall be his when a wondrously beautiful shrub, deep in hiding, responds to the description of Franklinia that is setting his brain on fire. That is setting his brain on fire." It's a really passionate description of a wild place, similar to the way Goldsmith was talking about it as well, but this time filled with that idea of adventure, entering it in order to find something considered to be lost. And that term lost species gets started to be used around this time as well. In fact, the title of her article is Lost Wild Plants, and she talks about a couple others as well. There's reports in local newspapers too. The Georgia True Citizen will report this person found Franklinia, and then scientists will go in and be like, no, that was Gordonia. They printed postcards to send to Boy Scout troops, local garden clubs, to try to enable the local people to report information back to the authorities, or I call them authorities, but the botanical institution, I guess. But still nothing kind of came through. No one was reporting Franklinia that could be confirmed. In 1922, Edgar Wherry went to search for it as well. And he took this was a little bit more of a scientific search. He took a party, they spread out, they looked at Bartram's writings, they figured like the square mileage of where it would be. And not only did they search where Bartram reported he saw it, they searched where it could grow. And this was the beginning of people thinking about, okay, what kind of soil can it grow in? Maybe that will help us figure out where it did grow. And of course, things had changed since the 1770s, so that was sort of an impossible search. But the investigations into Franklinia at this point kind of move into the lab or into the horticultural sphere, so that people are studying the soil, they're studying the propagated plants, and no longer really looking for it in the wild. That's not to say people don't still go out looking for it today. But the thing that's so fascinating to me about Franklinia is that it lives on in memory, even after it's extinct in the wild, for over 100 years, over 200 years, right? Ultimately, where research ended in the garden, and that is where it began. So the picture on the top there is the Bartram Gardens outside Philadelphia, and that is a Franklinia tree growing in front of the house. It is not the original Franklinia tree, which no longer exists. In the 1880s, Thomas Meehan, who was a very successful nurseryman in that area, found the Franklinia tree really damaged. Apparently it had been like run into by animals, cattle or pigs or something like that, and he grafted it to create a new tree. And I don't know if that one is the one Meehan created, but that was what kind of revived it on the grounds of Bartram's garden. And it was really important to Meehan to grow it in order to keep it alive and sell in his nursery, but also to grow it there at the Bartram's garden as a symbol of the contributions of the Bartrams. That they saved this tree from extinction is something that is repeated over and over again. Every single description of Franklinia I ever read says the Bartram saved it from extinction, and they did, so I'm not making light of that. But that is what it's known for more than anything else. You wouldn't even know it was from Georgia unless you looked into it. So it has become this kind of relic or icon of colonial botany, and because of the Ben Franklin name too, just a symbol of colonial America, of the Revolution and of those successes. So the title, the Ben Franklin Flowering Tree, this Kathleen actually sent to me when I was doing research, is from 1976. And in 1976, it was the bicentennial of the Revolution, and people were encouraged to plant Franklinia as in its memory. Seeds were given away, plants were given away, and this guide goes on to tell you how to take care of it. But there were also earlier ceremonial or commemorative plantings of the Franklinia, some of which I listed on there. So I found brochures from George Washington's birth celebration in the 1930s, in which people were encouraged to plant all kinds of trees, among them Franklinia. Independence Hall in the 1940s, a man named Charles Jenkins advocated very strongly to plant Franklinia outside of Independence Hall for its association with the colonial era. And just in April of this year, they planted two outside Carpenter's Hall, which is the home of the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, which Bartram and Franklin were both a major part of back in that era. So it's still continuing today. Not maybe next year in our anniversary of the Revolution, we'll be planting Franklinia again. We also have one memorial at least, in situ, meaning near the Altamaha, and that's the thing that looks like a tombstone that you're looking at there. Some of you may have seen this, I don't know. I know there's some people here from Georgia. This is the Georgia Monument to the Species, and it was erected in 1941 by the Long County Garden Club, primarily a women's group. It says the Franklinia tree was discovered by John Bartram, the first Native American botanist. And that's a weird turn of phrase, right? First Native American botanist, but this was 1941. On October 1st, 1765. It was located about 18 miles south of here in the swamplands of the Altamaha River. This tree was named after Benjamin Franklin and became famous as the Lost Franklinia. A member of the camellia family, this flowering tree was last seen growing in the wild in 1790. That used to be true. Now we have this John Lyne report of 1803. A specimen transplanted to Bartram's garden in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, survived and became the ancestors of the present cultivated plants. And that, again, it's not something I think we could definitively say, but you will see a lot of references to all Franklinia today are from the one that the Bartrams collected. But we know that seeds were sent all over the world, so we're not entirely sure that that's true. And then just to close, the last thing on here, the icon of extinction. This is why Franklinia has become, or how Franklinia has become so symbolic. Into the 1970s, the International Botanical Congress created a stamp in 1969, which is what you see at the bottom there. And this is kind of trying to, it was the first time the Botanical Congress was held in America. It was in Seattle. And they created a series of stamps, one for each region of the country, and Franklinia was chosen for the American South. And it was also mentioned during the meetings around the Endangered Species Act as the representative for extinct plants in 1976. So I'd love to hear in question and answer or in further discussion any other commemorations that you all know about this species. I see one of them over there. And thank you very much. Are there any questions or comments at this time? Yeah.
The debate whether it's the Loblolly Bay or whether it's the Loblolly Bay or the Franconia that's on the Florida state flag that Millie Francis is throwing out of the basket into the water. There's stories for both.
I don't think I know what that is.
The Florida state flag. There's a woman standing on the Florida state flag named Millie Francis, a
Okay.
Native American, and
The seal.
she has a basket and she's throwing flowers out onto the water for the dead Native Americans.
Right.
And there's a debate whether or not those flowers, there's stories for both, whether or not she's throwing Loblolly Bay flowers or Franconia flowers into the water. And I was wondering if you had an opinion on which one it was, because there's a debate.
I've lived in Florida 12 years. I've never heard that debate. I don't know of any references to it in Florida, so I think that might be wishful thinking to think it's.
Oh no, there's two
Franklinia.
different schools on the
Really?
flower she's throwing into the water.
Okay. I don't know. That would be interesting to find out if there was some discussion when they were making the seal, if they had written anything down. I don't have an answer to that. Thank you.
Here we go. So we're going to, again, open up the floor for questions from both Dr. Enright and Adam. Before we do that, though, I would be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity to welcome our guests from Bartram's Garden up in Philadelphia. If you want to just raise your hands, be recognized. We are so glad that you're here, and we hope to continue to deepen the connection between these different nodes of Bartram's living legacy. So thank you for coming. We're really glad you're here. Questions for the last panelists before we take a quick break and bid on things in the silent auction. We got microphones going around? I know we had some sort of tentative offerings already, but if there are more, now is the time.
I have a question on the Bartram Gardens, if you want. Is it still there?
I want to know how to get on your list. They get a seed or a plant or a bulb of the Ixia.
Yeah.
So we have a chapter newsletter. I can send you the info for that. But we do our plant sales every April. It gives or takes, or the date is not really exact, but it's in April. But would be a good time to get the Bartram's Ixia.
Okay,
So
thank you.
yeah, you're welcome. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question for Kelly.
Yeah.
You and I talked before way back.
Here you go, ma'am.
Yeah.
You and I talked before. I work with Franklinia at UGA, but from the botanical molecular side of laboratory related. One of the things because I was doing this with my PhD, did you find any documentation that somebody else collected other than Bartram, like in any, like John Lyons or Moses Marshall? And if not, where could we look to find that out?
So when I looked at what John Lyon had written, and there's actually a descendant of his that's an artist that was doing a project as well. So I don't know if she's found other things. The fact that they mention it, like the fact that the plant collectors are mentioning it, makes us suspicious they took it. We don't know for sure. To answer your question, I've not seen anything definitive, no. But I do think it was happening. I think there was, South Carolina, Charleston was a big botanical trade area, so there had to be local people whose names are not remembered that were collecting it as well. I just feel like they're, again, not evidence, there just had to be other people.
Well, the reason I ask is because it can't grow in the southeast because of this organism called Phytophthora cinnamomum, which is like a fungus, but it's in its own class. And that got spread through agriculture like cotton. And so one of the things that I'm working on is trying to get resistance to that, and which causes root rot. And, if your roots are rotted, you're going to die. So, but I did a genetic diversity study. So from Joel Fry's census back in 2000, I started from there and had people in arboreta, nurseries, botanical gardens send me plant or tissue, and I isolated the DNA. And the whole idea was, is there genetic diversity from what Bartram collected that could be used to get disease resistance?
Okay.
And you have to have some genetic diversity if you're going to do the standard breeding.
Okay.
And so I got it from maybe 100 different places, but I keep learning there's some in other places. So, but at that time, and what we found of the ones I collected across the world, because I got some from New Zealand, the Netherlands, Poland, Germany, Scotland, Kew Gardens, British Columbia, and then of course all around Philadelphia, one from a cemetery in Louisville where Muhammad Ali and Colonel Sanders are buried. So, and then there's one on 42nd Street in Spruce in Philadelphia that's well over 100 years old. And Joel Fry, the curator of Bartram's Garden, directed me there. And I have a picture of it, but if you see it, their limbs the Franklinia limbs get very low to the ground. And there is a headstone holding up one of the branches. So somebody said, help from beyond.
They seem to be a popular cemetery plant in the Northeast, actually.
So it's kind of ironic. But what I found out after doing the study is that there were two subpopulations.
Okay.
So the data, and this was all done by DNA comparisons, and so it showed a moderate amount of diversity. And so what that means is Bartram collected from at least two trees that we know of. Where they were in proximity of each other, we don't know. That's why I'm so curious if there were any historical records that there might have been other collections, because it's most likely he wouldn't have, whoever else went there might have collected from another tree. And it'd be interesting to see if it falls into one of these subpopulations. And if things go further, which I'd like with this research, I want to develop, well, there is a technique which I could get the DNA from an unknown and sequence it and find which population it would fall in. And I'm trying to work on getting a citizen science thing set up to where different gardens and everything can breed it. So give them like population, give them plants from the blue, plants from the red, and whatever they've got, and, you know, work toward trying to get this resistance.
Oh, okay. I
So-
would love to talk with you more about the biological work and
Yeah.
then the historical archive. And I haven't looked at those documents in quite some time, so there could be something more definitive that I could share with you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd
Thank
like
you.
to know that if, okay, thanks.
Thank you.